Alex here with part 9 of The Respondent. This chapter has more of the abstract slash kind of, I guess he's going through hindsight. He's reflecting. There are a lot of notes here from me because I could relate to quite a bit of it. And let's start with the impulse to fight harder. He says throughout his continuous losses, the author says that his single-minded focus was on the case, very consistent with my reaction as well. I ended up having the impulse to fight, which is not the most common reaction. I don't think it's that rare, but I think more often than not, people just choose to give up. Especially fathers compared to mothers. Mothers tend to, I think it becomes more of an existential threat when they lose custody of their kids and they panic. And fathers are like, oh, well, that's what everyone expected anyway. I mean, this is just all generalization, but in my opinion, the reaction or the impulse to fight harder from fathers is not as common as from mothers. Though now with joint physical custody becoming the norm, that gap is closing. Um, as I mentioned, single-minded focus on the case. Same thing with me, and it is detrimental to everything else in your life, your job, your schooling. It took me 12 years to graduate. Um, Relationships, friendships, it impacts everything. And I don't know if I'm going to say that that's a common theme, but I can say that that was my reaction until maybe year 3 or 4. And even then, I still had quite a bit of a focus on my case. It just wasn't, I wasn't single minded. So over time, I guess you can kind of train yourself out of that. But it wasn't until the termination of my ex's parental rights that I became completely free of it. Um, he says that he had this strong desire to at least best his ex once. I mean, I can understand that. Any, person would be frustrated with their ex winning every single time. He talks about the emotional sustenance that children provide to their parents. I mean, on the one hand, that's not good because it's supposed to be the other way around. You're supposed to provide emotional sustenance to your children, not vice versa. But I mean, I guess this is just a normal thing with being human. That's just, people have kids and they're going to expect some kind of emotional recognition from their kids. But I mean, that's kind of like an academic discussion maybe as to what are the limits of that, boundaries. I mean, when do you get to the point of enmeshment, parentification, stuff like that? I really don't know what to say as far as if any of that stuff might apply to him because I don't recall getting any of those details, but that did kind of make me stop and think, and I took a note of that. He talks about the gender war and his desire to avoid getting into a gender war. I do think that the gender war is a thing. I do think that it is hugely distracting to any kind of movement to reform the family court system because what it does is it pits mothers against fathers, and then they're not focused on the legislature and the court system, which is where the focus needs to be. Now, even though he says this in his book, I'm not convinced that through his actions he isn't actually throwing fuel onto this fire, throwing gasoline onto this fire. Um, Not convinced because of the remarks, the frustration, which I guess makes sense. I'm not trying to say that it's completely out of left field, but I do think that he could do more to avoid this being a problem. And maybe as I go through the later chapters, he does this. So we'll see. He talks about how success for one gender should not be defeat for the other, and vice versa. I mean, again, what I was mentioning earlier is constructively, it would be better if both genders united to demand competence from the family court system. And equal rights really is the foundation of that. I mean, to actually push for competence or the most competence that we can possibly get, oversight, those types of things, to actually push for those types of things, it gets complicated. And there are a lot of areas of family law that are counterintuitive. There are so many areas that sound like this is the way it should be. And actually, that just makes a high conflict child custody case even worse. So, this is really, I think it's going to be tough for a lot of the movements that are out there, both the mother's rights and the father's rights, and I guess, the anti narcissism groups to figure this out. It requires a lot of thinking. It requires a step away from demagoguery and going crazy and angry online. And I just don't even think we're 20% of the way there. And unfortunately, at this point, I don't think that the book does enough to move away from the gender war situation. I just don't. Emotionally stunted boys. He's talking about how emotionally stunted boys become toxic men, leads to antisocial behavior and violence. This is sort of going into the general research into the impact of boys who don't have a father figure. And so I think that he's really just trying to forward that discussion that really was started by other groups long before him, which is, I mean, it's good. At this point, I feel like most people have already heard it. Um, but still, it's good. How the schools are disciplining boys versus girls, how boys are considered defective girls. I mean, I haven't been in school in a long time, and I'm not sure that I see that with my son's education either. I guess he's trying to he this is a discussion on how boys tend to be more reckless. They aren't necessarily going to conform. They're going to resist things and fight things, and that's something that should be embraced. I mean, there are things he does touch on this in a lot of areas of the book. Um, I'm not sure that the schools are to blame here. I don't see the connection to the family court system at all. But maybe my opinion will change as I go further through the book. It talks about the medication of children, over medication of children, how it's not the best solution. This is so general that I just can't form an opinion on it. Again, my experiences are not consistent with his. My son's experiences, same thing. Robotic conformity expected of boys. I kind of touched on this already. I'm not, I mean, just this is not something that really strongly resonates with my experiences either, but it is something that he discusses heavily. He talks about drug pushing mothers. You know, I've seen vice versa. I've seen drug pushing fathers. It's, I guess it's a weapon that any high conflict ex could use. If they know that you don't want that, then they'll just decide that that's what they do want just because you don't. I've seen that, but I haven't really seen this kind of institutionalized push by mothers to get their kids on pharmaceuticals. I've seen anecdotes of it, and I've seen it come up in high conflict child custody cases, but I haven't seen an institutionalized. I mean, this is, again, guys, this is my experiences. Maybe other people feel differently. Um, he talks about heavy statistical studies. Um, Again, I feel like this is what I talk about in my video, abstract versus instinct. Sorry, abstract versus instance. I feel like he's bringing up these abstract statistics, and I'm not sure that there is a connection to the specific instance of his case, because at this point I'm not convinced that he's not the high conflict parent. First full meeting with boys 6 weeks after the litigation. He talks about how his mind drifted back to the last time that he was there with his sons. He coached Little League with them. He talks about the experience of being supervised by a state enforced third party. I mean, yeah, that's a humiliating thing. It was for me too. Luckily, I only had to go through it for 2 weeks, and it was only 2 supervised visits. But I do remember that is kind of a looming thing. You can't just ignore it. It's there. It's not a happy thought. It's not a happy realization. So yeah, I mean that's consistent with my understanding of supervised visits. He talks about how the kids told him, or they spoke aloud, that they were not allowed to get into his car because they might get kidnapped. Um, I mean, if that's something that his kids were saying, most likely that would be something that his ex put into their heads. I don't know if kids just throw the word around, the kidnapping word around like that without having been probably grilled a little bit. He talks about how the kids were put into a position where they were delivery mechanisms. He talks about how the kids spoke about how he was sick in the brain. This stuff is plausible. I mean, if you have an ex that is feeding them this type of stuff, they are going to blurt it out. He talks about how what his kids said next was forever haunting. And let's see, I mean, I put this in quotation marks, but I'm not sure if it's verbatim. I'm going to go ahead and read it since I'm going to give myself the benefit of the doubt that I put it in quotation marks to read it to you guys verbatim. Uncle lying next to me in bed and threatening to punch me in the face if I didn't go to sleep. And the other child, quote, said that he threatened to punch me too, unquote. Yeah, I mean, this is a really common thing when it comes to high conflict cases where one of the parents is put into, typically the targeted parent, is put into a situation where they feel that the kids are being abused and that there's nothing that they can do about it because the other parent has parental rights and they would have to go to court to get the approval of the court to curtail their parental rights. So this is, I mean, this is something that I think a lot of viewers here will relate to. Um, and did I feel like there were moments where my ex was abusing my son and there wasn't anything I could do about it? Of course. I mean, I talk about that with the dental neglect situation where if you guys have watched my docket series, you'll see that there was nothing I could do about the dental neglect until I got a judgment from the court. And it took 9 months and he ended up having 5 crowns and 2 extractions. So this is something that I think people who've been through the high conflict child custody case, a high conflict child custody case can relate to, which is that their ex is abusing their kids and that there's nothing they can do to stop it because their ex has parental rights and a court order to have time with their kids. I also talk about this a little bit in the video, Your Ex's Partner, with the context of what do you do if you don't want your kids around a certain person and your ex is allowing them around a certain person. That's talked about in that video. That's a thorny, extraordinarily frustrating situation for a parent to be in because a parent can always say, no, you can't be around my kids. But what happens if you've split up? And now the other parent who you're no longer with does want the kids to be around a certain person that you don't want them to be around. Once again, it's a litigation issue. He talks about how it's hard to have fun with a supervisor shadowing him and having what he calls a clock in his head. Of course, that's your time limit. If you have a supervised visit, you're going to have a time limit because the supervisor's not going to want to be there the whole time. They have, a life to get back to. Or if they're doing this as in a professional capacity, they probably have a schedule and other parents to supervise. So yeah, this is, very believable. And this is a thing. This problem with supervised visits is that you're on a time limit, and knowing that you're on a time limit in and of itself is looming. So the last note that I've taken is that he feels like he's been forced to answer for all of his sins and that she has a litany of sins of her own that she's never been forced to answer to. I can relate to this. I mean, this was similar with my ex. In my high conflict child custody case, I ended up having to jump through all these hoops and answer for all these allegations, and it felt like she had all these issues and problems, and she really wasn't. And I really wasn't able to force the court to actually look at her for years, for maybe 2-3 years. At that point, the court finally started to reluctantly look at some of the allegations that I had been raising. And eventually they realized that she was the problem. But I can relate to this. I mean, this is something that I think also was very common with regards to gender bias. You can watch my video on the topic gender bias if you'd like to learn more. But yeah, it's just a situation where mothers are just instinctively forgiven and fathers are forced to explain what they've been doing, why, how they're getting better, etc., etc. This is less of an issue now than it was probably when I first got into my high conflict child custody case, at least in the state of Nevada. Other states may still be having this problem, but I can at least say for my viewers, with regards to my experiences in my state, that it does seem like a very strong movement away from this issue, and that courts, at least in Nevada, appear to be looking into both genders equally, or very close to equally. This is all that I have for this chapter. If you have any questions, feel free to post them down in the comments below, and I will see you guys next time.